Or did I not know that?
All right, ready? All right, cool. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We want to place you in the position of the Israeli government in 2012. Peace talks with the Palestinians towards a two-state solution have stalled, and Defense Minister Ehud Barak has suggested that Israel ought to engage in an independent, unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank. Effectively, the way this would look is that they would surrender 90% of the territory which they control in the West Bank, maintaining 10%, which has approximately 85% of the Israeli citizens who live in the West Bank. So basically, keep a small fraction of the land where most people live, but surrender the rest of the territory, and to clear a space of land contiguous to the Palestinian territory on the Israeli side of the border, which is comparable in size to the amount of land which you've decided to keep. So that's actually very simple. Basically, keep a small part of the West Bank and then give them a piece of land of comparable size on the Israel side of the border to make up for that. So that was the plan that he's suggested. We want to place you in the position of the Israeli government and ask op choice, should you engage in this independent, unilateral troop withdrawal? One of the things important, like the 10% of land that you're keeping would include all of East Jerusalem and stuff like that. Questions?
So in the real world, wasn't this a deal that Palestinians had to accept? Are we just saying that the Palestinians would accept it if you?
No. In the real world, they negotiated to see whether or not they would arrive at a deal. And as you know from the present day, they have not arrived at a deal yet.
Right.
In this time period, this was someone suggested that Israel could just do this, right? Because they could just pack up and pull out their soldiers, right? They could say, like, we're just going to leave the West Bank. That's what this plan is. It would be. There's not a deal that's been reached. This deal would be you agree. Yeah, Israel pulls out its troops, backs up to defend the critical mass of Israeli troops, and no longer occupies the West Bank.
Yeah, Jerry, this is the West Bank, not Gaza. So
I know.
I don't know if that was a confusion, but just clarifying that. So.
Can you explain the land swap thing one more time?
Yeah, so I understand it sounds complicated, but it's actually not. Like, imagine there's like the whole West Bank, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the vast majority of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank are actually very close to Israel, which makes sense because they built close to home first, right? So you could keep 10% of the land right next to the Israeli border and give up 90% of the West Bank, and and then 85% of the Jews who live in the West Bank would not have to move. But 15%, we know we could debate about that. But in exchange for keeping that, because you can't just say, like, all right, well, the negotiation didn't work, we'll just keep some of your stuff, and that's fair. So in exchange, you're giving them a comparably sized, and we'll say for the purpose of this round, like, it would be comparably arable land, like reasonably livable and stuff like that, on the Israeli side of the border. So you basically... So I don't know how familiar you guys are with the negotiations that have been going on for the two-state solution, but the general concept has been some version of new boundaries and then trade, so Israel doesn't have to give up all of this land. So this would be Israel saying, this is the deal now. Like, Israel would be basically doing its version of that deal.
What are the Israelis' interests in the West Bank? Like, what would be their motivations for taking that land?
What do you mean taking it?
So, like, because they have troops there now, which obviously means they want to, like, hold on to that land. What are their interests in, like, holding on to that specific piece of land versus, like, having that other land?
Wait. So in the status quo, they have all of the West Bank and all of Israel. If you did this plan, they would have a small part of the West Bank, and they would lose a small part of Israel. Is that clear?
Okay, yeah.
What do you ask? Can you explain what you're asking? I don't understand.
All right. So the way I interpreted it was that they would, like, give up the West Bank, but then they would get another part that they could, like, a comparable area that they could call Israel, right?
No. So they would give up most of the West Bank that they control. They currently control all of it. They would give up most of it and keep a small part, and then they would give the Palestinians a small piece of Israel to compensate for the part they're keeping.
Oh, okay.
So Aaron, what I don't. So are they gonna give up a piece of Israeli land that currently has Jews living in it, and presumably they'll just leave and it'll be inhabited by Palestinians? Is that what you?
Well, like it doesn't have to be land. Like, I'm sure there's open land in Israel that's no one's living on. Like, it could be anything. The government could buy a tract of land and give it to the Palestinians. Like, they do not have to uproot. Let's say for the first round, they don't have to uproot Jews to give the piece of land.
Sure, but that land is going to end up probably being separated from the West Bank to some extent, or I guess it doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't have to be. We'll give them a contiguous piece. I think that makes the most sense.
All right. And so you're saying that, okay, and you specified, I just want to make sure I understand this little piece that you are that you're keeping from the West Bank. You said that comprises of about 85% of the Jews within the West Bank. It's like a significant amount of them.
Yeah. Is this confusing? I didn't think it was confusing, but as we're talking about it, I realize it might be. Is it confusing the way it's structured right now?
It was just the way I interpreted like the land swap thing. I interpreted it as like Israel getting land for giving up land rather than like giving back.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I'll think through the simplest way to explain it.
So how active are terrorist groups near the West Bank?
I mean, there are some terrorist groups in the West Bank, right? Like, obviously in Gaza, where Hamas is the ruling government, they have there is more terrorist activity. But there are some insurgent groups, obviously, probably within the West Bank. Israel does missions into the West Bank periodically to try to stop what they believe are terrorist operations or to capture people that go into homes and different things like that. Like all the atrocious rights violative things you hear about Israel doing. A lot of that's happening in the West Bank.
This doesn't deal for deal with right to return for refugees and shit either, right?
What doesn't?
Presumably, if you give them this area, it doesn't allow.
The independent unilateral withdrawal does not have anything to do with right to return. It's just land. You can make arguments for right to return. I'm not saying the round can never touch that, but I'm saying that this deal does not say anything about right to return.
Do you guys want to discuss for a second? We can mute ourselves or turn off all our volume or something.
Okay. I'm doing it on Facebook.
Alright, cool. To Facebook.
Monkey on Facebook.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are you guys doing?
Alright, we're gonna do don't do it.
I'm not going to withdraw.
Yep.
Cool.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a number of arguments. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that withdrawing from the West Bank is the best chance to create meaningful peace within the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We believe that any attempt to create peace must include a two-state solution. We think continued Israeli occupation and conduct an uncertain sovereignty creates too many problems for Israel. We'll name a few. The first is that Israeli occupation makes support of Israel untenable for potential allies like Saudi Arabia, isolating you amongst a sea of Muslims and undercutting regional initiatives. But secondly, if the Palestinians don't get their own state, they will always live in fear of Israel and always resort to violence and sectarianism via the security dilemma, which we think creates a number of problems for Israel. We also think, though, that until the Palestinians have a home, they're going to feel the need to actually entrench their distinctions between them and the Jews, embracing their culture at the expense of embracing regional connection, allowing Jews and Palestinians to engage in the very simple truth, which is that they are neighbors, they live next door, and in some sense can be the very same people. We think that's a much more important truth that they can only accept once they do have a second state. So that's fine and potentially uncontroversial. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we'd argue that bilateral or otherwise multilateral negotiations will never reach that goal. The principal problem is that the multilateral process includes too many actors with disparate interests trying to get outcomes that are favorable for them. There is very little common ground between the new democratically elected government, which is replacing Mubarak in Egypt, and America, who want a long-term solution. Even if you do believe that those individuals are, in some sense, allies, the truth is that they disagree on how much their commitment to Islam should be, which means they have a different view of how this conflict should be resolved. But secondarily, we think there are not clear parties to negotiate with on the Palestinian side. There is the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, but those groups always feel that they must always feel they have to issue ultimatums because they are from the inferior bargaining position. So because they feel like they are not in a favorable position at the table, they always feel like they have to issue ultimatums at the table. But even if both sides could agree, we think that they are essentially held hostage by obligations to fickle constituent bases. Voters force the PA to demand Jerusalem at all costs, a concession you as Israel can never make, because of security and religious reasons, and things like the right of return, which would uproot thousands of Jewish families currently living in Israel, a policy Israel cannot condone. We think negotiation only works if there's a common ground on critical issues, but in this instance, the things the sides claim are definitionally mutually exclusive, which means that they can never actually work. Moreover, we think that the ability for multilateral conversation to work is undercut by the fact that side opposition and the status quo that they're defending must still continue building settlements in the West Bank, which we think undercuts the ability to have any sort of negotiation in good faith. So we need a two-state solution, and multilateral discussion won't work. But we further note that Israel cannot simply wait around in the status quo. In the status quo, we think in the status quo, that works only as long as you have negotiating partners. But the longer you wait, the more likely it is that Hamas and Fatah will join back together, healing the schism that happened in 2007, creating something like, I don't know, hypothetically the Muslim unity government, which would create a bunch of problems for people in this region, removing your ability to have a credible partner to negotiate with. Moreover, we think that the current situation is also important because if it continues, it risks Israel losing American support. Gone are the days when the American public is willing to wage wars blindly and support any initiative and influence of its allies. We think that even if it's not the case that we're already ready to abandon Israel, the fact is that there is a clear path shift, a clear ideological shift within America towards a system in which one day Israel may not be completely supported. We think this is likely to be the case because Americans know that Israel cannot join other Arab countries even if they were on their own. And because of their nuclear weapon, it means that there wouldn't actually be more instability in the Middle East if they were left to their own devices. We think you cannot afford to keep flying in the face of the basic demands of the international community that you stop oppressing the Palestinians. On our side house, we take that action and ensure American support. So given that, we think a unilateral action would be accepted by the surrounding countries and groups. So first, the Palestinians will accept these boundaries, even if begrudgingly. We'd argue that some boundaries and an end to occupation are actually just better for the Palestinians. But even if the people don't support it, doing it ourselves allows the leaders of the people to actually take on this better deal without appearing.
Aaron, I can't hear you. I don't know if everyone else can.
No, I can't hear him either.
I can also not hear him.
Aaron, if you can hear us, we can't hear you.
I feel like this happens a lot.
Aaron Merrill?
Can't hear him.
Someone want to message him?
I think he just got it. He just exited out.
Yeah, he just hangs up and comes back, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Alright. Well, I'm just not going to time the rest of this because I'm now off time, but that's fine. Alright, cool. So the Palestinians will accept the boundaries, even if begrudgingly, because some boundaries and some end of occupation is preferable than a situation in which they're continually occupied by Israel. We think that we allow the leaders of Palestine essentially an ability to get out of the hostage situation we're in right now, where the people simply force them to keep holding on to radical positions, even though that's not actually what's best for them. On our side of the house, they get an end to occupation, and it looks like Israel did it, as opposed to them having caved at the bargaining table. We think the international community will accept it if the Palestinians go along with it, but even if they don't, countries abroad will acknowledge that this is at least a good faith effort by Israel, because multilateral isn't working. On our side of the house, we actually show that we're actually willing to give up things, rather than just holding complete control over everything and constantly declaring that we want peace. We think America will accept it if the international community does, but even if they don't, because they understand the position that Israel's in, and also want them to have the best situation going forward within the future. We think then that on our side of the house, we think minimally the international community will think this is a better structure than what's been done in the past. So the impact of this international goodwill is a few-tiered. The first is that in the best case, everyone accepts the solution, and Israel sheds its international pariah status, regaining access to valuable markets and ending concerns and boycotts, aiding their domestic economy and helping the people within Israel. But in the most realistic case, where Palestinians don't accept the deal, but nations elsewhere at least see it as a good step, we think this provides the necessary shift in dialogue for nations like Saudi Arabia to create military pacts with Israel against Iran, which is particularly important because America is not risk-sensitive enough to the dangers of nuclear Iran to actually act, and Israel needs to make sure it has more sensitive allies. But even in the worst-case scenario, where just America supports this deal, we think that's still better because we've minimally secured American support for decades to come. The second argument we'll advance is that ceding control of the West Bank to the Palestinian government is a better situation in the territories. We create incentives for Palestinians not to support terrorist groups. When Israel is no longer the enemy, Palestinians will no longer accept terrorists living among them and in their communities. We think the Fatah itself will learn from the lessons in Gaza, where when controls were not put down, chaos was allowed to reign supreme, and they will actually force the radicals out to ensure that these sorts of things don't happen, which we think is excellent on our side of the house. Secondly, we think we put the onus on Fatah to actually govern. In the status quo, groups can get by politically just claiming to be sufficiently anti-Israel. But on our side of the house, they have to now provide the actual services and security for their people, which A, takes money away which they could have used to fund terrorism before, but B, just ends the international conception that all the problems in this area are being caused by Israel. We think that on our side of the house, these pressures also create a moderating effect, because groups can't just be sufficiently anti-Israel. They have to actually defend policies and objectives, moderating the Palestinians, which we think is necessary for peace going forward into the long term, which we think is incredibly, incredibly important. The third argument we'll advance is that withdrawal from the West Bank creates better initiatives and outcomes within Israel itself. First, ending the occupation saves tons of money that can be used to build institutions within Israel. Occupation of the West Bank costs $6.3 billion a year, literally paid to continue a quagmire that threatens Israel. We can divert that money to help people in Israel safely on our side of the house, which we think is better, softening any reaction they could have to our plan. But secondly, we think that pulling troops back to defensive positions is better for Israeli security. If Israel were ever to be attacked, the troops in the West Bank wouldn't be of use because they would be spread out among a hostile civilian territory, while pulling them back to the border encompasses them within the broader Israeli defense. Lastly, we think a concrete solution to the situation is necessary in order to reduce the radical nature of Israeli domestic politics. We no longer have a massive constituent base of people lobbying to expand the West Bank because we have a conclusive solution. We can now move towards better, moderate domestic policy and not just be governed by this one issue. We're incredibly proud to propose.
All right.
Okay, so I'd like to start out by saying that the main problem with Aaron's case is that he goes over the entire idea of a two-state solution and says that the minute you get this two-state solution, once you get to that point, there's going to be peace in the Middle East, that we solved everything, that by having a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, we've all of a sudden fixed all of the problems. But recognize that there are more deep-seated, long-term problems that are going to fester after a two-state solution, that are going to end up creating problems for Israel, and now that they've given up all the significant amount of territory in the West West Bank, they're not going to be able to defend themselves against these deep-seated issues as they used to be in the past. So let's go through our 3 off-case points. And the first one is basically that you want to be able to be defensive. And the amount of territory that you have in the West Bank, or controlling the West Bank, allows you to have a strong defensive position when you are trying to defend your country. Recognize, first off, that you want to keep the military there, because as long as you have this large area filled with just military bases, just military personnel, it is literally a national security apparatus that exists in this one area for you to that you can basically engage in any sort of military operation that you need to against terrorist groups or terrorist organizations. We think that's very valuable to you. We also think that if any kind of terrorist act occurs in the West Bank, it's going to affect military personnel rather than civilians, which is much better for you on the Israeli side. On top of that, we think that if you end up giving all the West Bank away, then what ends up happening is that you have more difficulty in engaging in military operations against suspected terrorists. So assuming that terrorist organizations probably still exist after you find this two-state solution, you're going to want to engage in some sort of military operations against them. But the fact that you don't control this area, that you don't have the same national security apparatus in the West Bank that you used to, means that you won't be nearly as efficient in engaging in these operations, which means that operatives inside the West Bank have increasingly more power against you. On top of that, we think that you need to maintain the vitality of the Israeli state. We think that if citizens of Israel are in a much more dangerous place, then what ends up happening is that they are at greater risk. This means that the vitality of the Israeli state, the prosperity of it, ends up going away. We think that by having a defensive area on the West Bank, you end up maintaining the prosperity of the greater part of Israel, and we think that's important. But our second off-case point is that you want to build up an Israeli state, and that's important. Just having the state isn't enough. So like just owning like the eastern part of Israel and you know all of the Holy Land isn't enough to actually have an Israeli state. We think that you need to have a strong and prosperous one if you want to move on and like build your state from there. We think that like a small bullied state that basically gave up all its territory to Palestine in order to get this two-state solution, but might not necessarily get all of the benefits that they think they're going to get in return, is not a good enough reason to give up the West Bank. We think that it makes Israel smaller, it makes them less powerful, and it means that they don't have the strong state that they were vying for. We think that Israel should be allowed to take over the West Bank because it gives them a way to expand their state on territory that they were technically given. On top of that, we also think that no one's going to live in Israel as a result. Recognize that you need support from the people who think that they're protected, who think that living in Israel is actually a good thing. If you give up the entire West Bank and lose that national security apparatus, if attacks become more frequent, people just simply aren't going to want to live in Israel. We think the Israeli state's going to crumble in that situation, because now you only have the hardcore, very hardcore Jews who are going to live there because they believe in the Israeli state, but you don't have the people who actually help aid the vitality and the growth of the state, which is an problem down the road. So we think that by keeping the West Bank, keeping that national security apparatus, you have more people living in the state, which maintains its vitality. Third and finally, we think that by giving this up, by giving up Palestine, creating this two-state solution, all you result is giving up, results is in a weak Palestine. Because you already have so many different interests in Palestine, in the grouping of people that call themselves Palestine, what's going to happen is these interests are going to play out once a new state is created. So what ends up happening is that these various terrorist groups are going to have all their interests played out, and what ends up happening is probably they're, one, still going to hate Israel after all of this happens, and two, still be hostile towards Israel after all of this happens, which means all you did is give an estate to a group of hostile terrorist organizations who now have a voice inside a Palestinian government, making them even more powerful. So we think that this is a bad thing for you in general. You should continue with the multilateral negotiations that don't allow for this to happen. But let's move on case. In Aaron's first on case point, he brings up the idea that this requires a two-state solution, and how part of Israel is, or that Palestine is always going to resort to violence until you create this two-state solution. What we would tell you is that what the two-state solution is going to do is it's also going to create these distinctions. As long as you have two states between Israel and Palestine, and you know that these people hate each other, there's not going to be like negotiations between the two groups. There aren't going to be Israeli and Palestinian people engaging in business in business down the road or things like that, what's going to end up happening is going to further entrench the differences between these people, because now that you've created a two-state solution, you've created an even greater distinction between these two people, and it's going to pervades the violence even further when you have groups inside of the Palestinian government that still continue to hate Israel. Same goes for the Israeli government that will continue to hate Palestine. So all you've done is put two countries that hate each other on each other's borders, which we know has like never historically ever been a good thing. Take India or Pakistan or any two countries that hate each other and live on each other's borders. Second, we think that he gives all these arguments about how like multilateral negotiations aren't going to work and how there's no Palestinian Authority now. But we think that a weak Palestinian state is going to be difficult to negotiate with, and as a result, it's going to become a larger problem for Israel than just having to deal with military operations that root out terrorist organizations, rather than dealing with a weak government that they now have to recognize as a government rather than a terrorist organization, limiting their ability to deal with the problems that like occur as a result of this organization. They also said that no negotiations are going to occur later because Palestine is just going to take this stance, this one-arm stance. But we think that the problem is that you don't want to weaken the nation still, so you don't want to give up this land. Even if Palestine does disagree with many of your views, you still have the support of the international community. We think that the United States is always going to want democracy in the Middle East, so will the rest of the international community. So being like one of the only democracies in the Middle East would help you in this situation, because what you're able to do is provoke that, or you're able to call yourself the only democracy in the Middle East and promote those values, which means that the United States and other international communities are always going to support you. On top of that, he said that the Palestinians are going to accept these boundaries and that they're going to stop having these radical beliefs because of the good faith effort by Israel. But we tell you that without a strong government, with all these terrorist groups still hating Israel inside the country, it's not going to matter. We think that when you have all of these voices, the ones with the guns are going to end up like being the most loud or the loudest, and as a result those people are the ones, the terrorist organizations, who are still going to hate Israel, who are still going to engage in conflicts against Israel. We think that's a bad thing. They said even if Israel, but even if Palestinian doesn't, what you end up doing is you create a better image for Israel. Sure, but in the world in which what we want, which is that you don't give up the West Bank, occurs, like that it ends up being good, we think, and then why even bother like sending the deal over to Palestine? Because if you get what we want, then don't ever send over the deal. We think this is pretty intuitive. They said even if just America supports it, that's okay. We think fine, sure, but there are better ways to negotiate with multilateral talks in which you can still have America on your side. In their second on-case point, they said that it's good for the territories. They said that Palestinians, once they have this two-state solution, aren't going to accept terrorists, and the terrorists are going to be much more weaker because they're going to have to spend money to protect the people because now they have a state. We tell you that's not how organizations gain power. They gain power through hate and rhetoric, and because they can still engage in these long-term attacks against Israel, it's not going to stop because you can fester that hatred that exists in the country. Third and finally, they said that occupation is expensive. We tell you that your defensive and national security interests are the more important thing than the amount of money that you would end up spending on it. We also think that it makes it easier to engage in military operations in the area, which you lose by vacating the West Bank. For all those reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Cool. Everybody ready?
Yep.
Thank you, Mark, for the interesting op. I think opposition has taken a really interesting advocacy here, where they've come out and said they should not even advocate for a two-state solution at all, that they should just continue to have these delayed negotiations that are going to go on forever without ever actually accepting a deal. We think this is absolutely the worst thing that Israel can do. Why? First, the perception of it now is that Israel is continuing these negotiations, but continuing to delay them so they don't actually have to give anything up, and so that they can continue to keep them. This is why the international community has foregone support for Israel, because of the idea that it looks like many of the problems in Israel and in the Middle East come out of the fact that Israel is actually refusing to negotiate. By going to the hardliners and taking this new stance that you won't accept a two-state solution, you're going to lose all of your international support. This is bad because this is going to include the United States of America, which is starting to become wary of the fact that they have to continue to support Israel, which violates human rights on a daily basis and makes the U.S. look terrible in the rest of the region where they're trying to combat terrorism and create a good public image of themselves, something they can't do when they support Israel. So we think you can lose American support, which means you lose the military aid, which gives you the strategic advantage over all the other nations in the first place and makes you actually able to fight the terrorist groups which are interested in attacking you. But furthermore, we think it's just going to continue to incentivize terrorist groups to attack you, because the reason these terrorist groups are attacking you is because the Palestinians don't have their own state. When you give them their own state, many of them are going to lose the incentive because they now have what they want and they're going to stop attacking you. We think this is very good. But furthermore, we tell you not creating a two-state solution, not opening yourself up to the international community, also loses you the ability to make a bunch of agreements with the other Arab nations who want to work with you to defend against Iran, who's creating a nuclear weapon in the status quo. We tell you this is a problem because the U.S. is not taking a strong enough stance against Iran, the largest security threat you have, much more dangerous than any small terrorist groups hiding out in the West Bank. We say it's better to create this public image that you are doing the right thing to garner the support and be able to stand as a unified Middle East against Iran, which the other Arab nations already want to do due to this Sunni-Shia split. Now I want to jump straight in to what Mark said about being defensive. And the first thing he told us is you want to be able to defend yourself. But we tell you very much in the status quo that the troops you have in the West Bank aren't good for defending Israel. Because if anyone did want to invade Israel, they would just ignore the places where you have your troops stationed, and your troops would not be able to retreat to help you, because then they would be stuck in unfriendly, hostile territory where they would be having to fight house to house to get out of the area. So they won't actually be able to help you. We think if you really want to defend your state, we say draw them back to where you have actual Israelis living now so that you can truly protect them. And the next thing that Mark tells us is that you basically stop terrorists by being on the ground. But we told you that occupation is the thing that creates terrorists. Many of these people revolt against Israel because they are in the land, because they aren't allowing them to have their own state. So we think we cut out a lot of the support in that situation. But he also missed the arguments that we gave you about how the Palestinian Authority, or the negotiating arm of Fatah, is actually going to start to become a good governing force. They're going to look at what happened in Hamas, in Gaza with Hamas, and they're going to realize that they do have to crack down on these terrorist groups unless they want to risk losing all of their power and no longer being a credible force. So they're going to have to start providing security in all these other problems. We think they're going to be able to stop the terrorists because they are most of the groups right now. We think they themselves can stop attacking. We think they're going to be happy with this negotiation because they probably want their own state, and they're just being forced by their radical populace to not accept the deals that you're offering them at the moment. But let's talk through a scenario where you actually are attacked. So let's say there is some sort of terrorist attack and you are hit. So we think you as Israel can take a very easy stance here. All you basically do is if there is some terrorist going on out attacking you, you go to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and you say, we want you to stop these terrorists. They have two options, or three options. Either they say no, which they won't do because they don't want to look terrible on the international sphere. They say yes, and they actually go out and do it, which we think they will because you could provide them with financial support and strategic intelligence to make sure they are able to find these people and stop them, or they say that they aren't able to do it. At the point at which they say they aren't able to do it, you either offer them support, or you have an ally like the U.S., Egypt, or any of the other Arab nations who now want to work with you come in and offer them military support. So it looks like you don't even have to get engaged at this point anymore. You can have an ally come in and stop the terrorists from attacking you. We think that's going to strengthen your strategic relationship with other nations and the region, and also not hurt you publicly, and make it look like it's actually the Palestinians attacking you. Because in this situation, when the Palestinians start attacking you after you've given what the international community perceives as a good deal, as a strong concession to them, it's going to make the Palestinians look like they're the ones who are in trouble, which is going to make you not lose a lot of international support and maintain your strong relationship with countries like the U.S. and rebuild relationships with people in Europe. So the next thing that Mark talked about is basically how you want to build an Israeli state. And he basically said that you need more land, you don't want to be bullied, and basically you need the West Bank. But the problem with maintaining the West Bank I went over in my overview, which is all the problems where you lose international support, you continue to get terrorists to attack you, you don't ever release the trade embargoes and oil embargoes that are placed upon you by all of the Arab nations, meaning that you can never be an actual regional player and you can never actually fight against Iran. Things that we think are incredibly bad for you, things that we think you don't want to support. You don't want to just ignore this two-state solution going forward in the future. Your international support from the U.S. is not going to last forever. And finally, Mark tells us that there's going to be a weak Pakistan, that they're going to fight each other and they're going to hate you after all at the end of it. But first of all, we gave you lots of analysis about why Fatah is going to come in and how you can support them with financial aid and military intelligence. But we also think it's very likely that Egypt or any of the other Arab nations who don't want continued instability in their in their backyards are also going to come in and support Fatah to make sure that they don't end up in a situation where they can't keep a hold on their populace. They're going to stop people from shipping in weapons. They're going to stop the terrorist groups provide intelligence. We don't think a weak Palestine is going to be that bad. We don't think the attacks are going to be there. But we have to tell you that you either do this and maybe accept some sort of short-term instability before Fatah and your allies come in and take over, or if you don't accept a two-state solution, you are literally going to be existing in a continuous world where you always have terrorists attacking you, where you always have people threatening the Israelis. If you really want to stop the terrorist attacks, maybe there might be some short-term instability on our side of the house, but it's better than on their side of the house where they're advocating literally for the instability to continue in perpetuity. With that said, I'm going to move on, Case. The first thing we talked about is how this is going to create a meaningful peace and how occupation is going to allow you to work with the Arabs and all these different things. Mark basically told us again that the two-state situation is bad because these people are never going to live together, never going to work together. But we told you the reason they hate you, everything I said off, Case, just reapply here. We think the two-state situation is good, and this pretty much creates a de facto two-state situation, which the international community is going to hail as a great move forward, just as they did when you left Gaza before. So the next thing we told you is basically that multilateral negotiations will work and that the two-state solution will never come. They've kind of basically accepted that this is true, and they've kind of said we don't want a two-state situation. We've told you many times why this is worse for Israel, and we gave you several reasons following this about why you can't just wait around. One of them including the idea that Hamas and Fatah might come back together, they might end the schism and become one party working against you, which we think would be worse for you in any sort of world when they're suddenly working together against you. You're going to lose American support and you can't join the Arabs. We think we're going to destroy the instability. Now, to losing American support, the thing that Mark did tell us is that the U.S. supports democracies, and you're the only democracy in the Middle East, so they're going to continue to support you. But we tell you that's not necessarily true. First of all, Egypt is actually kind of a democracy. Some of the nations are sort of democracies around the area. But furthermore, we tell you that the reason why the U.S. isn't supporting you is because you are consistently suppressing people's rights. So are you even really a democracy if several million people within your nation aren't even allowed to vote or leave their country or have access to basic things like medical care and other services which they should be provided? But furthermore, we tell you you've already lost a significant amount of support. The UN made Palestine an observer a long time ago because they are tired of Israel acting this way and not taking meaningful steps in the negotiations. So we think you've already lost a significant amount of international support. Don't lose any more. Finally, we told you, or furthermore, we told you that the Palestinians will accept the boundaries. How they might take it begrudgingly, and yes, they might still hate you, but they're still going to like this significantly more than you just continuously not giving them anything into perpetuity. The impacts of this are you get to stand up against Iran, your true national security threat. You get to keep American support, and you no longer are boycotted, which means you get to open up your economy to a variety of different markets, which is going to be significantly better. The following analysis we gave you was all about how Fatah is going to make sure there aren't actually radicals killing you constantly. And finally, we told you about how you simply have better economic outcomes and a better way to stop radicalism within your nation. For all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
My timer died. Wait a minute, 1 second. All right, everyone ready?
Yes.
The first thing I want to point out is that what Mark said is that this two-state solution won't solve, that this is stupid. Maybe a two-state solution at some point in the future would solve a lot of the problems that they're saying exist. But we're not going to kill ourselves trying to get one that just functionally won't work. Maybe a two-state solution is fine, but we're not going to kill ourselves trying to get one. The problem with this two-state solution is it doesn't solve a lot of the underlying problems that is still going to lead to radicalism in the West Bank, but not give Israel a way to actually defend themselves when those kind of radicalism materialize into actual multiple attacks. Other underlying problems exist: the right to return, not having equal access to water and electricity, just underlying ethnic and religious tensions that exist in multiple areas in the world, such as India and Pakistan. The problem is a lot of these problems are still going to exist, but now Israel doesn't have a way to combat them by actually operating in the West Bank. Furthermore, it's not just the West Bank that's going to be the problem. Obviously, you have problems in the Gaza Strip and with Hamas, but one of the problems is a lot of these operatives go over to the West Bank and just seek shelter there. We saw this when the 3 Israeli teenagers were killed. Israel felt the need to go into the West Bank and arrest 500 Hamas operatives. Whether or not this was justified, that means that there were at least 500 Hamas operatives there. We're telling you that when you do have a state, when you do have a state off in the West Bank, what is this going to mean? It's going to mean that terrorist organizations, even if it's not the West Bank government, are still going to have shelter. And now it's not going to be shelter in a region of the world that Israel controls as military. It's going to be shelter in a sovereign state that's able to do things like go to the ICC, say you're invading the territory when you come in and try and deal with these terrorists. They're not going to go away. Hamas is still going to be there. They're still going to have problems. Some of those problems include the embargo that they haven't talked about lifting that still makes it harder for gasoline and steel to get into the Gaza Strip because those things are used for weapons. We tell you it's likely that they're still going to go to the West Bank, still going to launch attacks from it, or still just hide from it, or still just hide from Israeli authorities while they launch attacks from the Gaza Strip. And now it isn't able to combat them, meaning they don't have a more peaceful solution. They don't have a two-state solution that is actually functional. The first thing that we told you is that you need this in order to be defensive. At the very least, even if you're not combating terrorists there, it at least counts as some kind of buffer zone against every other country in the Arab world that wants to kill you, whether it's Syria or Lebanon, or whether Jordan gets pissed off at you again. We tell you having a military operation base there makes sense because not only are you able to be more likely to monitor them, but you're more able to monitor the people that are in the West Bank that are probably getting support from these countries when they either launch attacks themselves or go into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The problem is, when you make this a functional state, now they're able to not just smuggle in weapons from somewhere else. They're able to have actual arms deals with people like Saudi Arabia, people like Iran. We tell you that that's going to make it harder for you to actually combat them because now they're legal, they're more fair, now they're more legal, meaning you're not able to actually operate them. Things like blowing up tunnels in order to get into your state are no longer going to be feasible because they're just building tunnels. We tell you that when you have actual things, maybe nuclear weapons someday, coming into the border, not able to functionally stop it without going to the ICC and going to Security Council. We tell you that that's bad. On our side of the house, we at least have the claim that this is not a state, but an actual violent region of the world that we're operating for our own security. We tell you you're able to stop a lot of the bad things that happen when you give terrorist organizations the authority of a state behind it. We also tell you that you're going to need these military bases to deal with lots of other regions, maybe Hezbollah in Lebanon. We tell you that you might not want to have all those military bases, that shit going on in Israel. Maybe you have jails there. It's just beneficial to have this area, and we tell you that that's important. But then Andrew says, well, then you can go and deal with these terrorists anyway. The West Bank will just let you in and say, yes, please purge us of our evil extremists. We tell you that there's a lot of problems with this. First off, it's not likely that they will even recognize that there are extremists in the country because why would they? They're a sovereign state. Most likely the terrorists aren't bothering them. And furthermore, if the terrorists are exhibiting some kind of nationalism against Israel, that's probably beneficial to just consolidating their power. I mean, they're not going to recognize that there are extremists even in the country, which leaves you with two options. Which leaves you with two options. Either you ignore the terrorists and they continue doing bad shit to you, or you just go in and forcefully invade. Why is this worse than the status quo? Because now you're just not using your military bases that are already in West Bank, but now you're invading a sovereign country to weed out terrorists. We tell you that that's not going to work because they're able to raise legitimate concerns about you just invading their country. We tell you that that's a problem, and that's something that they're going to have to deal with. But the second thing we told you is that a stronger state is just better. We tell you that this is why you're building settlements in the West Bank in the first place, because obviously you do have some kind of stake in this land, whether it's for religious reasons or whatever other reasons. And the other reasons, it's not just staying in this 10% that Aaron talks, 10% of the region that Aaron talked about. You are not Aaron Murphy or Andrew Cobb Sullivan. You're the head of the Zionist project. That is going to be beneficial when you do just want to have a stronger state that appeals to your voters. When you just pull out, we say that that's going to be bad because people are just going to lose support for you. And furthermore, if you do have a less stable Israel, if you do have one that just has more violent extremism because you're not able to combat Hamas in the West Bank, we tell you that people are just going to flee. You're going to have a less secure Israel in general because you just have less people there. The third thing that we talk about is how you're going to have a weak Palestine and the problems that come with that. Recognize they're still going to be pissed at you, but they say that you're able to just get intelligence. You can just give the intelligence to them so they can deal with them themselves. They're not going to have intelligence, Mr. Speaker, at least not to the extent that you have now when you're not physically in the West Bank. The problem is that you're going to have not only have less intelligence than you have right now, but you're going to have more problems when people are able to, when Iran is able to actually fund Hamas legally through just shipping them weapons in the West Bank, because now the government can just disperse them to whatever operatives exist in the West Bank, and Israel isn't able to actually go in there and stop them to the extent that they are. Furthermore, they can bring up bring up actual war crimes. So you don't just have you don't just have a Palestine that's domestically weak because they're still pissed off at you, but they're an unstable region that now has the authority and legitimacy of a region that's much stronger and can bring up actual complaints to the international community to a much greater scale, which you do not want to happen as Israel. On case, the first thing they talk about, and this is kind of the basis of the entire case, is that withdrawal is going to lead to peace, and that a two-state solution is going to get to that, Mr. Speaker. We've given you lots of reasons about why you're not going to get there, why the underlying problems are still going to exist. Well, what happens when you try and deal with those? Two things can happen. Either you don't deal with them and you continue having terrorists lobbing things at you, or you do deal with them and you just have to take control of this region again, which makes you look worse off than you do in a status quo. I mean this as a picture, a very likely one, Mr. Speaker. Say Hamas runs over to the West Bank and continues doing terrorist operations against you. Now you go over to Fatah and say, let us in to get these people, and they say no. So you decide to take the region back rather than just keep having terrorists at you. Now you look worse than you actually do, because you were saying, we're going to give this region to you. Oh wait, we changed our mind, we're taking it back. This looks worse than the status quo because you're seen as breaking your deal. You're seen as just going back on your word. We say that that's going to lead to more extremism. It's going to radicalize the Arabs that you don't want to have lobbing missiles at you on your border. Then they say that you're not going to have a two-state solution either. You're not going to have a two-state solution in any world with democracy because Fatah agree have to appeal to the voters. First off, the majority of voters do support some kind of two-state solution, but they're not going to support a unilateral one where Israel just takes what they want and leaves what they don't. We tell you the problem with this is it doesn't deal with the underlying problems, such as not having access to equal electricity and water. That's still going to lead to a lot of problems, still going to lead to a lot of violence, and you're not going to have a way to actually deal with them. If you want to have a two-state solution that's palpable to both sides, agreeing to it on some kind of mutual ground is going to be much more beneficial to just unilaterally agreeing, to unilaterally leaving. This is not going to give the government the ability to say, well, Israel did it, so you don't have to get mad at us. It's going to make the people say, well, you didn't even try. You just let Israel do this, and it's going to lead to more problems, and you're not going to have the support. Then they say America's going to support this decision. America's going to support whatever decision you do. But the problem is when you're not there in the West Bank dealing with terrorists, and maybe America's going to have to, we tell you that if they do, it's going to lead to just more inflammation of the region when they're dealing with terrorists there, whether they're there or they spill out somewhere else. Then they say Palestinians are going to accept the borders. No, even if the West Bank does, God probably won't be fine because you still have the embargo against them. They'll go into the West Bank, you won't be able to deal with them. The second thing they say is that you're going to have better international relations, and this is going to be seen as a good first step, and this is good. We tell you that in the long run, you're not going to have better international relations because either you let the terrorists attack you, or you have to go in there, you're seen as breaking your word, and that's going to be even worse in the eyes of the international community. Then they say Palestinians will just kick the radicals out, and somehow this will solve. They're not going to be willing to do that. They have no reason to do that, meaning you just have you have a more radicalized state that's going to lead you or force you in order to overstep your authority, overstep your military might, and it's just going to look bad again. The third thing they talk about is how it's good for Israel and that it saves money. Three responses to this. First off, we get a lot of money from the United States and other people by saying we're defending ourselves. You're going to lose that money if you suddenly claim that you don't have a reason to anymore. Second thing is that we already told you that it's going to be largely worth it for your security. You're not going to be able to put a price on that. Thirdly, is that it's expensive to operate elsewhere. Say you have to move all these military bases to either the north of Israel so you can combat Lebanon and Hezbollah, or say you just have to move your jail cells that you have in the West Bank, or just move everything else. We tell you that that's going to be largely expensive, especially when you somehow have to figure out how to monitor Syria from somewhere that's not on this border. We tell you that that's not going to be good. Then they say that you're not going to boycott and that this is beneficial. First off, the boycott barely has any effect because few people participating in it, and if the boycott Sunday does have the effect, the United States will be able to compensate you, and that'll be fine. They say you don't want to just be governed by one issue, Mr. Speaker. There is no issue that's more important than people that are being killed, many civilians being killed by radicalized state with the authority to bring up crimes such as this.
Alright, I think this has been a really great round. I'm going to close out this rebuttal. So I'd like to start out by saying that basically what side government is trying to tell you is that some sort of two-state solution, however you get to it, any way in which you get to it, no matter how defensively bad for you it is or whatever it is, as long as you get to some sort of two-state solution, that equals peace. What we are telling you is you're not only suddenly going to have some sort of sunshine and rainbows diplomatic situation with the Palestinian government just because you found this two-state solution. We think that we've given you multiple examples of how a new Palestinian government isn't exactly going to like be on your side. In fact, they are going to be hostile to you, and you've just given up all the leverage you have because you moved all your troops out of the West Bank. So let's first talk about the defensive problems that we continue to tell you are going to occur if you move your troops out of the West Bank. First off, you want to engage in military operations against terrorist operatives who are in the West Bank. As we've explained, terrorists from Gaza who move into the West Bank so that they can actually, like house themselves there or hold on to territory there. We think that is going to be a persistent problem. We think that when the Palestinian government comes into power, they're not going to be able to control that problem as well as the Israeli military is in their current status inside the West Bank. So we think that you have an even greater situation in which now there are more terrorist organizations that are going to move in the West Bank because they see it as a safe place to hide out, and there's nothing that Israel can do about it because you just left all your troops and all your military bases and went back into a civilian area inside of Israel. But on top of that, we would also tell you that what you're doing is by moving all your troops out of the West Bank, which isn't widely populated, what you end up doing is creating a close civilian border between you and a hostile country. So what you've ended up doing is you've effectively taken a military buffer border, gotten rid of it, and put your civilian border against their border with like terrorist organizations and other insurgent groups that are now living on the other side directly across from them. So we think that this is a terrible thing that you can do for your national security, and we think that by having this national security apparatus, by moving into the West Bank, we think it helps protect your country a lot more. We would also tell you that you're going to have problems with this hostile country. Recognize that Andrew comes up here and he gives all these reasons as to why a new Palestinian government wouldn't possibly be able to have terrorist organizations within its country because there are just so many checks. Like they can't say that they're not going to deal with this, and if they can't deal with this, then you can deal with it. Well, first off, recognize Palestine is probably still going to be a hostile country because a lot of people in there hate you, which means they're probably not going to recognize the fact that they have insurgencies in the country, even though they probably know that they exist. As long as they don't recognize that the insurgency exists in that country, basically you're faced with the option of invading the country and engaging in military operations on sovereign soil, or you end up getting attacked by all these insurgency groups that are living inside the West Bank but aren't being recognized by the Palestinian government. So we think that it makes a much more difficult diplomatic situation for you rather than when you just controlled the West Bank with your military and could root out all of these insurgency groups. We think that you have a better situation right now, and that's why we think you shouldn't have to like kill yourself over a two-state solution when you have this great situation for defense already set in place. Second, we would tell you that negotiations probably aren't going to lead to anything that are in your interest. We think that the most important thing you should do as Israel is to protect your interests in the status quo, because a two-state solution can happen down the line, but you want it to happen on your terms. You want to make sure that you are in the best position. And we tell you that fighting for a two-state solution is unnecessary when you do it for no other reason than having a two-state solution because you feel that leads to peace. We think that the current situation is better for you than the proposal that side government has given us. And as a result, we think that you should continue with the current situation, because trying to get a two-state solution for any reason possible, just because you think it's going to lead to peace, just because you think Palestinians or the international community are going to like you, doesn't mean it actually leads to better outcomes for you. And we're telling you that if the current situation is better, if you have this defensive agreement that you can persist, we think that's better. Third and finally, we think the problems are pervasive. We think that a two-state solution isn't going to lead to these solutions. We told you, you put a poor country next to a rich country, which means you're going to fester all of these kinds of differences. You're going to fester all this kind of violence. And we would tell you that the deep-seated hatred for Israel means that if Israel ever does anything wrong in negotiations with Palestine, it's automatically going to provoke violence because of the way that these two countries have the way that these two peoples have treated each other for so many years. So for all those reasons, we think that the problems are just going to be pervasive, and they're not going to go away just from a two-state solution. So for all those reasons, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Who creates a real two-state solution? So first, let's start with our side of the house. We said something very simple. We said, pull out, you get a de facto two-state solution, which ultimately will be accepted. They've given us two reasons to believe that's a terrible idea. The first is that they claim this is going to be a terrorist state. And the basic concept here is that they think terrorists are going to be able to come in and basically run wild now within the Palestinian territories. Mr. Speaker, as Andrew eloquently pointed out in MG, this argument only works if you actually believe that the terrorists themselves are still going to exist in the same format when they now have been given the one thing that they said they cared about. what we explained is that on our side of the house, the terrorist individuals no longer have an incentive to attack Israel at all. We never got contestation on that. Only the argument that, well, they want unrest, but never explaining why they want unrest if that unrest comes at the expense of their own people. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, we explained that the idea of this terrorist state doesn't work because the Fatah, or whoever the government of the Palestinian Authority becomes, has an incentive to work with Israel or the international community to stop this. And this is where the round gets wacky, because Jerry and Mark think they have a brilliant argument. They're like, well, they're not going to admit they have terrorists in their country. This argument makes no sense at all. The idea that it does not have any impact on a government if they have terrorists launching operations out of their country is ludicrous. The idea that that doesn't affect foreign direct investment, the idea that that doesn't affect instability, the idea that for some reason the government of Lebanon, for example, likes having Hezbollah control half of their state makes no sense. What we explained is that Fatah has an ardent incentive to shut down the terrorists who exist within the country so that they can actually have stability, and they'll ask the surrounding people to help. The only thing you can apply there for them is that the MO said, well, Iran might step in and do it. But we tell you that the Palestinians have an incentive not to work with Iran, and instead to work with either Israel or Egypt or America, as we explained. Why is that the case? Well, first, Iran is a Shia state, where the Palestinians are predominantly Sunni, which means they have an incentive not to work with them first. They like Saudi Arabia more. But second, beyond the fact that just a religious distinction, they have an incentive to do it because they also probably fear Iran and hate the instability that would cause the Middle East. So that argument doesn't work for them either. The only other thing they have here is that, well, the only impact of this, though, is that they do become a terrorist state, we might have to reinvade the country. I want to be very clear. That is never an argument that we made in this round. We will never reinvade the Palestinian territory. On our side of the house, we think the incentives align such that they will work with us if terrorism does break out. But the other reason they told you it could be bad is, well, there could be terrorist attacks within the country, and now you won't have any ability to go in and stop them. So first, that's contingent on the fact that there are still terrorists within the West Bank, even though they've been given a free country. Second, it's contingent on the fact that the Palestinian government doesn't want to work with Israel or other countries to stop the terrorist attacks. Third is contingent on the fact that you have to actually have bases in the country to conduct intelligence operations. Like, I think this is ludicrous. That's like saying that America needed to invade Russia in order to launch intelligence operations during the Cold War. It makes no sense to believe that you can't launch Mossad operations in the West Bank just because it's another country. Like, it is not invasion of that country to have intelligence operatives in the territory. I think it makes no sense on their side of the house. But even if you do believe that on their side of the house that all this stuff is true, we think that on our side, even if you think that people don't like these different things, the kicker is that Israel is already surrounded by hostile states in the status quo. Like, that literally is Israel, which means that they needed to show a comparative reason why having one more hostile country surrounding Israel was the meaningful tipping point for the end of the Israeli state. All they said is, well, maybe Iran will put missiles here, but they never explained why that was more dangerous than the missiles which already exist, for example, in Jordan, or for example, already are controlled by people in like Kuwait or places like that. Without giving that argument, I also never explained why there was an impact of any of this. I think that's problematic. But here, look, Mr. Speaker, even if you didn't buy any of that, even if you thought it was the case that our side house, we do have all these negative harms, it is always a comparative question. You have to compare our plan to their plan. Now, what did they tell you? First of all, they told you that they think they can still get a multilateral solution. I think that Mark went left, Jerry went right, and now they're going down. Why? Because they can't get a multilateral solution if they keep building settlements. We explained that that breaks down the process. Secondly, we said they don't have a partner to negotiate with, never responded to that. And lastly, we explained that the radicals within Israel itself won't allow you to budge on Jerusalem, which means you can't get peace. What does that mean? It means they get no multilateral process to ever build a two-state solution going forward in the future. So the only thing, so on their side house, they have to be stuck within the status quo, which you explained is untenable because you're surrounded by an international community that continually boycotts you. Jerry says the boycott doesn't work. First of all, that is just a lie. The BDS movement has literally an app within the United States where millions of American citizens are protesting Israeli goods, which is cutting against the Israeli economy. But even if you don't think the individual people's boycotts make a difference, we think that things like the Gulf States oil embargo against Israel certainly do make a difference. And those things never go away on their side of the house because those people's voter bases won't allow them to support Israel. We remove these things, which makes Israel's economy better, which actually creates a stronger state. Now, the MO gives you one response to this. He says, well, I don't think that you get these things pulled away because the international community won't accept this deal because it doesn't seem like everyone agreed to it. We already preempted this in PMC. What we explained is that, yes, it might not be perfect. Yes, people might be upset, but it is the best option available to Israel because a multilateral solution will not work. And without them explaining to you a way that a multilateral solution could work while you're still doing settlements, they must agree. And to the international community's eyes, this appears to be the best action possible. And we also explained to you that the Arab states in the region want to work with Israel. They just need some sort of action on these issues so that they can justify it to their populace. Why? Because we explained that you need to work together on issues of security, like the Iran question. They never addressed why it was the case that the nuclear Iran does not outweigh individual insurgent groups, things like like that. On our side now, so we get these benefits, which means we are better for Israel in the long term, while they are stuck with a quagmire. The last thing I want to close on just outweighs everything, because you could intervene in this round, Mr. Speaker, and say that yes, only a perfect solution can ever solve, and conversation is the way to go. But even if that were the case, they would need to explain to you how they could ever moderate these two sides to a point where meaningful conversation could occur. We explained that the only way you do it is by making the discussion in Palestine no longer about who is anti-Israel, but about who actually can provide good services and has good policies for the people. Without that on their side of the house, they could never reach an agreement, even within their multilateral framework. We're very proud to propose.
Cool. I will stop broadcast now.